November 4, 1979, Tehran, Iran. What began as a student demonstration outside the United States Embassy would soon become one of the most dramatic international crises of the 20th century. For 444 days, American diplomats and civilians would remain captive inside the embassy compound. Television screens across the United States would broadcast images of blindfolded hostages, angry crowds, burning American flags, and a crisis that seemed to have no end. But the Iran hostage crisis did not begin on November 4. To understand why those gates were stormed, why the American embassy became a prison, and why the crisis lasted for more than a year, we have to go back decades. Because behind those 444 days was a much deeper story of revolution, foreign intervention, oil, political power, distrust, and two nations that had gradually come to see each other as enemies. In the middle of that conflict stood ordinary people who suddenly found themselves trapped inside history. The story begins with Iran itself. For much of the 20th century, Iran had been ruled by the Pahlavi monarchy. In 1941, Mohammad Reza Pahlavi became Shah after his father abdicated during World War II. The Shah was strongly supported by the United States and Britain. Iran was strategically important. It had enormous oil resources, sat in a critical location between the Middle East, the Soviet Union, and the Persian Gulf, and was considered an important partner during the Cold War. But the relationship between Iran and the Western powers was complicated. One of the most important events came in 1953. Iranian Prime Minister Mohammad Mossadegh had become a powerful nationalist figure and had moved to nationalize Iran's oil industry, challenging the influence of the British-controlled Anglo-Iranian Oil Company. Britain opposed Mossadegh's policies. The United States became increasingly concerned that political instability could push Iran toward the Soviet sphere. The CIA and British intelligence supported a covert operation that helped remove Mossadegh from power. The Shah's position was strengthened. For many Iranians, however, the events of 1953 became a lasting symbol of foreign interference. The memory would remain, and decades later, revolutionaries would repeatedly point back to it as evidence that the United States had interfered in Iran's internal affairs. The Shah continued to modernize the country. His government launched major economic and social programs, expanded education, industrialized parts of Iran, and strengthened the military. But modernization came with another reality. Political opposition was heavily restricted. The Shah's secret police, Savak, became infamous for surveillance, arrests, and allegations of torture. Opposition came from many different directions. There were nationalists, there were leftists, there were religious conservatives, there were students, there were intellectuals, and increasingly, there were followers of a powerful religious leader who had spent years criticizing the Shah. His name was Ayatollah Ruhollah Khomeini. Khomeini had opposed the Shah's government since the early 1960s. He criticized the monarchy, Western influence, and policies he believed were damaging Iran's Islamic identity. The government eventually forced him into exile. But exile did not silence him. From outside Iran, Khomeini continued to build a powerful political movement. His speeches and messages were distributed throughout the country. By the late 1970s, Iran was becoming increasingly unstable. Economic problems, political repression, social tensions, and opposition to the monarchy were converging. Then came 1978. Mass demonstrations spread across Iranian cities. The protests grew larger. The government attempted to restore order. But every crackdown created more anger. People poured into the streets. Workers went on strike. Government authority began to weaken. And in January 1979, the Shah left Iran. He initially described his departure as temporary. But the monarchy was collapsing. On February 1, 1979, Ayatollah Khomeini returned to Iran after more than a decade in exile. Millions of people gathered to welcome him. Within weeks, the old political order was effectively gone. The Iranian Revolution had transformed the country. The monarchy had fallen. A new Islamic republic was emerging. And the United States suddenly faced a completely different Iran. Washington had lost one of its most important regional allies. The new revolutionary government viewed the United States with deep suspicion. American officials, meanwhile, were trying to understand what had happened and what the new government would become. But the greatest problem was trust. Iranian revolutionaries believed the United States had supported the Shah for decades. They remembered the 1953 coup. They remembered American military and political support for the monarchy. And they feared that Washington might eventually attempt to restore the Shah. Those fears would soon become explosive. In October 1979, the Shah was allowed to enter the United States for medical treatment. He had cancer and required medical care. The decision was controversial inside Washington. Some American officials worried that admitting him could provoke the revolutionary government. Others argued that humanitarian considerations justified allowing him into the country. The Shah entered the United States. In Tehran, news of his arrival spread quickly. To many revolutionaries, it appeared to confirm their worst fears. They believed the United States was preparing to shelter the former ruler and possibly organize his return to power. American diplomats attempted to reassure Iranian officials that the Shah's admission was for medical reasons. But the revolutionary movement was already deeply suspicious. At the center of Tehran stood the United States Embassy. The compound had become a symbol. To American diplomats, it was a place of work. To Iranian revolutionaries, it represented decades of American influence. The tension around the embassy increased. Then came November 4. Early that morning, several hundred Iranian students moved toward the embassy. They called themselves Muslim student followers of the Imam's line. At first, embassy security believed the demonstration might be another temporary protest. But the students were determined to enter. They climbed over the walls. Embassy personnel attempted to secure the compound. Some Americans destroyed sensitive documents. Others tried to contact Washington. Inside the embassy, confusion spread rapidly. Doors were locked. Telephones rang. Documents were shredded. Employees moved through corridors trying to determine what was happening. But the demonstrators were already inside. The embassy was seized. American personnel were taken hostage. The world had entered a new crisis. At first, American officials hoped the situation would be resolved quickly. Perhaps Iranian authorities would intervene. Perhaps the students would leave. Perhaps negotiations could begin. But something unexpected happened. The revolutionary government did not immediately remove the students. Instead, the takeover gained political support. Ayatollah Khomeini endorsed the occupation. The embassy was transformed from a diplomatic facility into a symbol of revolutionary resistance against America. The hostages were no longer simply people caught in a protest. They had become bargaining pieces in a confrontation between two governments. The United States demanded their immediate release. Iran refused. and the crisis began to dominate international headlines. The hostages were separated. Some were blindfolded. Some were interrogated. They were kept in different parts of the compound. Their daily lives became unpredictable. They did not know how long they would remain there. They did not know whether they would be released tomorrow, next month, or years later. Outside the embassy walls, the revolution continued. Iran was undergoing enormous political transformation. The old monarchy had disappeared. The Islamic Republic was being established. Different revolutionary factions competed for influence, and the hostage crisis became a powerful political weapon. For many Iranians, the embassy occupation represented resistance against decades of American influence. For Americans, it became a national humiliation. Television brought the crisis directly into people's homes. Every night, viewers saw images of the hostages and the crowds outside the embassy. American news organizations began tracking the number of days. Day 10, Day 20, Day 50, Day 100. The number became a symbol of frustration. 444 days. President Jimmy Carter faced one of the greatest foreign policy crises of his presidency. The administration had to balance diplomacy, military pressure, domestic politics, and the safety of the hostages. A direct military invasion of Iran could have caused catastrophic consequences. The hostages might have been killed. American forces could have become trapped in a wider war. Iranian nationalists could have rallied around the regime. The Soviet Union could have exploited the chaos. So Washington initially focused heavily on negotiations and economic pressure. The United States froze Iranian assets. Economic sanctions were imposed. Diplomatic relations deteriorated. But the hostages remained inside the embassy. For the families of the captives, the crisis became intensely personal. Every day brought uncertainty. Every news report created hope and fear. A photograph of a hostage could become a source of comfort. A rumor about negotiations could create optimism. Then another failed diplomatic effort could destroy that optimism. The crisis was becoming more than a foreign policy problem. It was becoming an emotional wound across America. Meanwhile, inside Iran, the hostage crisis strengthened hardline revolutionary forces. The occupation allowed leaders to present themselves as defenders of the revolution. Anyone calling for compromise risked appearing weak. The crisis also diverted attention from internal political conflicts. Iran was attempting to create a new political system while simultaneously dealing with economic problems, institutional instability, and competing visions for the country's future. The embassy occupation became one of the defining symbols of the new era. But the situation was not static. Behind the scenes, American officials were searching for a way out. Diplomacy continued. Secret contacts were explored. Various proposals were considered. But the central question remained. How could the United States bring its citizens home without starting a war? By early 1980, frustration inside Washington was growing. The diplomatic approach had failed to produce a release. President Carter faced increasing pressure to take stronger action. The American public wanted results. The families wanted their loved ones home. And the administration knew that simply waiting could make the crisis even more dangerous. Then, in April 1980, Carter made one of the most consequential decisions of his presidency. The United States would attempt a rescue mission. It would be extraordinarily risky. The plan required American military forces to travel deep into Iran, land in the desert, move toward Tehran, rescue the hostages, and escape. The operation would have to remain secret. It required helicopters to travel hundreds of miles through hostile territory. The mission was codenamed Operation Eagle Claw. For the people planning it, this was not a movie. It was a complex military operation with almost no room for error. And the margin for error was about to disappear. On April 24, 1980, American forces began the mission. Aircraft moved toward Iran. Helicopters flew through the darkness. The plan depended on several helicopters reaching a remote desert location known as Desert 1. But the mission encountered problems almost immediately. Dust storms created dangerous conditions. Mechanical problems affected helicopters. The force could not proceed as planned. The number of operational helicopters fell below the minimum required for the next stage. The commanders faced an impossible choice: continue and risk disaster, or abort the mission. The operation was cancelled. But the worst moment had not yet happened. During the withdrawal, an American helicopter collided with a transport aircraft. A massive fire erupted. 8 American servicemen were killed. The rescue attempt had failed. The hostages remained captive. The United States had suffered a military tragedy. And Iran had witnessed an American operation collapse inside its territory. For President Carter, the failure was devastating. For the hostages, it meant something even more frightening. Their chance of being rescued had disappeared. The crisis continued. But history was moving toward another turning point. The American presidential election of 1980 was approaching. The hostage crisis had become one of the central political issues in the United States. President Carter's opponents argued that his administration had failed to protect American citizens and project American power. A former California governor and actor-turned-politician, Ronald Reagan, was challenging Carter for the presidency. The phrase "America held hostage" became deeply connected with the political atmosphere of the campaign. Every passing day made the crisis more politically painful for Carter. But inside Iran, another major event was approaching. The Iran-Iraq War began in September 1980 when Iraq invaded Iran. The revolution was still consolidating power. Now Iran faced a major external war. The country was entering a completely different phase. The hostage crisis, however, remained unresolved. The captives had already spent months inside Iran. What had begun as a protest had become a geopolitical standoff. The world watched. America waited. And the people inside the embassy continued counting the days. But eventually, the negotiations would begin to move again. The United States and Iran would eventually reach an agreement. The hostages would finally leave Iran. But they would not walk out until after one of the most extraordinary final twists in American political history. The crisis would last 444 days. And when the final day arrived, the timing would become almost impossible to separate from the American presidential transition. Before that final moment, however, the hostage crisis would reshape American foreign policy, transform Iran's relationship with the West, influence the reputation of an American president, and leave memories that would remain powerful for decades. The story of the Iran hostage crisis was never simply about 52 Americans trapped inside an embassy. It was about the collision of two revolutions. One revolution had taken place in Iran. The other was taking place in America's understanding of its own power. And between them stood a locked embassy a divided world, and 444 days that changed history. The failed rescue mission had changed everything. For President Jimmy Carter, the disaster in the Iranian desert was not simply a military setback, it was a personal and political crisis. 8 American servicemen were dead. The hostages were still trapped. And the United States had demonstrated that even its most carefully planned operation could fail under the harsh conditions inside Iran. But the crisis was not over. In fact, some of its most important events were still ahead. After Operation Eagle Claw, the Carter administration began searching for another path. The military option had not disappeared completely, but the risks were now painfully clear. The United States needed diplomacy. Iran needed to decide what it wanted from the hostages. And both sides needed a way to end the crisis without appearing to surrender. Inside Iran, the political environment was changing rapidly. The revolutionary government was consolidating its power, and the hostage crisis had become deeply connected to the country's new political identity. The American embassy was no longer being treated as an ordinary diplomatic mission. It had become a symbol of the revolution. The documents captured inside the embassy were also used by Iranian revolutionaries to support claims that the United States had been interfering in Iranian affairs. American diplomats were portrayed as spies. The old relationship between Washington and Tehran was effectively destroyed. For the hostages, however, political symbolism did not make their captivity any easier. They remained separated and under guard. Their routines changed from day to day. Some endured long periods of isolation. Others were interrogated. Many struggled with uncertainty. They had no reliable idea when they would be released. The psychological pressure was enormous. Imagine waking every morning without knowing whether you were going to spend another night in captivity. Imagine hearing rumors that negotiations had succeeded, only to discover that nothing had changed. Imagine knowing that people outside the compound were discussing your future while you had almost no control over it. That was the reality for the Americans inside the embassy. Meanwhile, the crisis was changing the United States. For months, American television had shown images of the hostages. One of the most recognizable symbols became a simple phrase: America held hostage. The crisis dominated news coverage. Families of the captives became public figures. Churches held prayers. Communities organized support. People wore yellow ribbons as a sign of solidarity with the hostages. The yellow ribbon would eventually become one of the most enduring symbols associated with the crisis. But underneath the public displays of support was growing frustration. Americans wanted their government to bring the hostages home. Carter's administration was under enormous pressure. The president had tried diplomacy. He had imposed sanctions. He had frozen Iranian assets. He had authorized a military rescue attempt. And yet the hostages remained captive. The political consequences were becoming impossible to ignore. Then another crisis emerged. In September 1980, Iraq invaded Iran. Saddam Hussein's government believed that revolutionary Iran was vulnerable. The Iranian military had been weakened by the revolution. Political chaos had disrupted the old military structure. Iraq believed it could take advantage of the situation. Instead, the invasion began a devastating war. The Iran-Iraq War would last for years and cause enormous suffering. For Iran, the war created an entirely new strategic environment. The revolutionary government now faced an external enemy. National survival became a priority. The hostage crisis remained important, but the wider war began to reshape Iran's calculations. The United States was also watching the war carefully. Washington feared that instability could spread across the Persian Gulf. Oil supplies were strategically important. The region was becoming more dangerous, and the Cold War remained in the background. The Soviet Union had invaded Afghanistan in December 1979. The United States now faced a series of major geopolitical shocks. Iran had experienced a revolution. American hostages were being held in Tehran. Iraq had invaded Iran. The Soviet Union had entered Afghanistan. The Middle East was becoming one of the most dangerous regions on Earth. For Carter, these events created an extraordinary foreign policy challenge. But the hostage crisis remained the issue that Americans could see every night on their television screens. As the months passed, the crisis entered the American presidential election. Carter's opponents argued that the country had lost confidence in its leadership. Ronald Reagan presented himself as a stronger alternative. The election campaign became intensely focused on America's standing in the world. The hostages were still captive when Americans went to the polls in November 1980. Ronald Reagan won the election, but the hostages were not released immediately. The negotiations continued. And this is where the story becomes particularly complicated. The United States and Iran had been negotiating through intermediaries for months. The central issues included Iranian financial assets that had been frozen by the United States, claims against Iran, and guarantees concerning the hostages. Iran wanted assurances. The United States wanted the hostages returned. Neither side wanted to appear weak. The final agreement became known as the Algiers Accords. Algeria played an important role in facilitating the negotiations. The agreement established a framework for resolving financial and legal disputes while securing the release of the American hostages. But even after the agreement was reached, the hostages did not immediately walk free. There were still final details. The timing mattered. The political transition in Washington was taking place. Jimmy Carter was preparing to leave office. Ronald Reagan was preparing to become president. And the hostages were still in Tehran. January 20, 1981. The day had arrived. Ronald Reagan was sworn in as the 40th President of the United States. Millions of Americans watched the inauguration. The new president delivered his address. But while the ceremony was taking place in Washington, another historic event was unfolding far away. The American hostages were finally leaving Iran. After 444 days, their captivity was ending. The timing was extraordinary. Within minutes of Reagan's inauguration, the hostages were released from Iranian custody and transferred into the process of returning home. For Americans watching the events unfold, it was an emotional moment. The crisis that had dominated their lives for more than a year was finally ending. The former hostages traveled to Europe before continuing to the United States. They were greeted as heroes. People lined streets. Flags were displayed. Families waited. There were tears, embraces, and celebrations. The hostages had survived, but the experience had left lasting scars. Some struggled with the psychological consequences of captivity. Others attempted to return to ordinary life. But ordinary life was difficult after spending 444 days at the center of an international crisis. The Iran hostage crisis was finally over, but its consequences were only beginning. The relationship between Iran and the United States had been transformed. The two countries had once been strategic partners. Now they were bitter adversaries. Diplomatic relations were severed. The United States and Iran entered a period of hostility that would continue for decades. The embassy in Tehran never returned to its previous function. The building became a symbol of the Iranian Revolution. In the United States, the crisis became permanently associated with the presidency of Jimmy Carter. Historians have debated how much the hostage crisis contributed to Carter's defeat. The answer is complicated. Carter faced inflation. He faced an energy crisis. He faced economic difficulties. He faced international challenges. But the hostage crisis had a powerful psychological effect. Many Americans believed their country had been humiliated. The images of blindfolded hostages became symbols of national frustration. The failed rescue mission reinforced that perception. The successful release of the hostages came only after Carter had lost the election. As a result, the crisis became deeply connected to the rise of Ronald Reagan and the beginning of a new political era. But there is another side of the story. It is easy to remember the crisis only through presidents, revolutionary leaders, generals, and diplomats. But the people who experienced it were ordinary human beings. The American hostages had jobs. They had families. They had homes. They had plans. Some were diplomats. Some were military personnel. Some worked as administrative employees. They were not expecting to become international symbols. On the morning of November 4, they were simply doing their jobs. By the end of the day, their lives had changed completely. That is one of the most important lessons of the crisis. History is often remembered through dates and famous names. But history is experienced by individuals. A political decision made thousands of miles away can determine whether a person sleeps safely in their own home or spends the night under armed guard. The Iran hostage crisis demonstrated that reality in the most dramatic way. It also demonstrated the power of symbolism. To the Iranian revolutionaries, the American embassy represented decades of foreign influence. To the United States, the seizure of the embassy represented a direct attack on diplomatic principles. The same building carried two completely different meanings. One side saw resistance. The other saw aggression. And because both sides interpreted the event through their own historical experiences, compromise became extremely difficult. This is why understanding the crisis requires understanding the history that came before it. The hostage crisis did not suddenly appear from nowhere. It was connected to the 1953 overthrow of Mossadegh. It was connected to the Shah's government. It was connected to Savak and political repression. It was connected to American support for the monarchy. It was connected to the Iranian Revolution. It was connected to Khomeini's rise. It was connected to the fear that the United States might attempt to restore the Shah. And it was triggered by the Shah's admission into the United States. Each event added another layer. By November 1979, the pressure had become overwhelming. Then the embassy fell. The consequences reached far beyond Tehran. The crisis changed how Americans viewed Iran. It changed how Iranians viewed America. It changed American politics. It influenced American military planning. It demonstrated the danger of attempting complex military operations in hostile environments. And it reinforced the importance of intelligence, logistics, specialized forces, and careful planning. Operation Eagle Claw became a painful lesson for the United States military. The failure contributed to efforts to improve coordination between different branches of the armed forces. Years later, the United States would create a much more integrated special operations structure. The lessons of 1980 would remain part of that evolution. But perhaps the most enduring consequence was psychological. The hostage crisis became part of America's national memory. For years afterward, the phrase Iran immediately reminded many Americans of the embassy, the hostages, the failed rescue mission, and the humiliation of 444 days. In Iran, the story was remembered differently. The embassy takeover was celebrated by many revolutionaries as a victory over American influence. The former U.S. embassy became known as the Den of Espionage. Its captured documents were presented as evidence of American interference. The event became part of the mythology of the Islamic Revolution. Two nations walked away from the crisis with two completely different memories. America remembered captivity. Iranian revolutionaries remembered resistance. And both memories shaped the relationship that followed. The crisis also demonstrated something fundamental about international politics. Power does not always belong to the side with the strongest military. The United States possessed overwhelming military superiority. Iran could not match America's conventional military power. But the hostage crisis was not a conventional war. The hostages themselves became leverage. Every American military decision had to account for their safety. That limited Washington's choices. The Iranian revolutionaries understood this. They knew that the United States could not simply destroy Tehran without risking the lives of the people being held. This created a strange balance. The weaker side possessed something the stronger side desperately wanted: the hostages. That is why the crisis lasted so long. The United States could threaten. Iran could resist. But neither side could easily force the other to surrender. Eventually, negotiation became the only realistic path. The Algiers Accords provided that path. The hostages went home. But the relationship remained broken. Even today, the consequences of that period continue to influence relations between the United States and Iran. The issues have changed. Nuclear negotiations, sanctions, regional conflicts, military confrontations, diplomatic disputes. But the memory of 1979 remains part of the background. The hostage crisis is therefore not simply an old story. It is one of the foundations of the modern relationship between Washington and Tehran. And perhaps that is why the story continues to attract historians, journalists, filmmakers, and audiences around the world. Because it contains nearly everything that makes history dramatic. A revolution, a fallen monarch, a powerful religious leader, a superpower, a secret intelligence history, a seized embassy, dozens of hostages, a failed military rescue, a presidential election, a war, secret negotiations, and a final release that occurred at the exact moment one American president left office and another took power. But beneath all of those dramatic elements is a much more human story. People were caught inside a conflict they did not create. Families waited. Diplomats endured captivity. Soldiers died attempting a rescue. Political leaders made decisions under enormous pressure. And ordinary citizens watched from thousands of miles away. For 444 days, the world waited to see how the crisis would end. On January 20, 1981, it finally did. The American hostages were free. The United States celebrated. Iran moved forward into another chapter of revolution and war. Jimmy Carter left the presidency with the hostage crisis permanently attached to his legacy. Ronald Reagan entered the presidency at the moment the hostages returned. And the world entered a new era. But history rarely provides simple heroes and villains. The Iran hostage crisis was the product of years of distrust, political decisions, foreign intervention, revolutionary anger, strategic calculation, and human fear. To understand it is to understand that major international crises rarely begin with a single event. They build. One decision creates resentment. One intervention creates suspicion. One revolution changes the political order. One diplomatic decision triggers anger. One protest becomes an occupation. And suddenly, the world is watching. The lesson of the Iran hostage crisis is therefore larger than the story of 52 Americans. It is a warning about what happens when historical grievances are allowed to accumulate until diplomacy can no longer contain them. It is a reminder that national pride can make compromise extremely difficult. It is a reminder that military power cannot solve every political problem. And it is a reminder that ordinary people can become the most vulnerable pieces on the international chessboard. November 4, 1979. The embassy gates were breached. January 20, 1981. The hostages finally came home. Between those two dates were 444 days of uncertainty. 444 days of negotiations. 444 days of political pressure. 444 days of fear. 444 days that changed the United States. 444 days that changed Iran. And 444 days that changed the history of the modern Middle East. The photographs remain. The documents remain. The memories remain. And the story remains one of the clearest examples of how quickly the relationship between two nations can transform from partnership into confrontation. The Iran hostage crisis began with a revolution. It continued through fear and mistrust. It survived a failed rescue mission. It became entangled in an American election. And finally, after more than a year, it ended with the return of the people who had become its most visible victims. History would move on. But the consequences would not disappear. The United States and Iran would remain separated by decades of suspicion. And whenever those two countries confronted each other in the years that followed, the shadow of Tehran in 1979 was still there. A reminder of what had happened. A reminder of what had been lost. And a reminder that behind every geopolitical crisis are real people whose lives can be transformed in a single day. The gates opened. The hostages left. The planes took them away from Iran. After 444 days, they were finally going home. And the world would never look at the relationship between America and Iran in quite the same